evening, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome again to another reading session. I am once more your host, Pixel Broadside, otherwise known as a Pinoy in Victorian. Welcome once more to a continuation of our reading session through the Northern Lights anthology of Canadian short fiction. This is, again, a continuation of The Sacrifice by Adele Wiseman. I am now starting at the second part, which is page 27 of the original anthology. So, dim lights, sit back and relax, maybe put out and ready a warm cup of tea, and let us proceed. That first year, the winter descended very close on the autumn leaves. The city huddled in its own warmth among the piled up snow. Although with a certain fondness for their native landscape, the citizens claimed that mad mountains sheltered them away from many a violent wind. The winds had apparently learned to circumvent this hazard and blew most persistently from the undefended north. In the evenings, caged in the square room with the chair, the bed, the couch, and the other landmarks that the landlady had so minutely detailed, Abraham paced restlessly as his past years in their fullness forced themselves over him. Strength, he knew, strength was what was required of him now. His part was to accept, to rebuild, and to wait. It was no use to dwell too much on those memories that came at a man unawares with bitterness. The main outlines were clear. Nowhere was it said that it would be a honeyed life, not here in these alien lands. But how strong the gall had been, how bitter when it came. Still, there had been the miracle, the reiterated promise. How would he have stood it else? Isaac, still weak from the typhus that had forced them to halt their flight temporarily in Poland, seemed to fall prey to every common cold that made its way from breath to breath in the city. From the window of their room, he watched now the snow piling up in warm, rounded, shadowy heaps. Come away from the window, growled Abraham. You coughed all night last night. Don't think we didn't hear you. The landlady and her big window, he continued as Isaac turned back to his homework. From every big inch of it, a big draft. He peered out at the shadowy backyard, holding his hand at the same time to where the sharp chill had made its way through the hole in the storm window, filtered through the frozen rags that were stuffed into the cracks of the inside frame. What are you standing in the draft for, then? Isaac challenged over the newspaper that he was deciphering. One son, Abraham was beginning to realize, was as hard to bring up as three. I haven't got a chest cold. I don't cough all night, he retorted righteously. But he did not linger with his usual pride on the fact that he had so neatly made his point. There was a real concern in him for the boy. He came and looked over Isaac's shoulders at the newspaper. For a while, twice a week in the evenings, he and his wife had gone to the English classes. Sarah had sat shyly and blushingly couldn't answer the questions that were put to her by the young teacher, who spoke neither Yiddish, nor Ukrainian, nor Polish, nor Russian, nor German, but nevertheless attained an appallingly fluency in the English tongue. Abraham fidgeted during the class and came privately to the conclusion that, beyond the parts of speech, the teacher did not seem to have much to tell him. In the end, what with Sarah's indifference and his own overtime at the butcher shop, he had decided that they could teach themselves. So he contented himself with looking knowingly over Isaac's shoulder at the newspaper and making great leaps across sentences, pouncing on an odd word or two, from which he constructed privately plausible meanings, from some of which Isaac had the greatest difficulty in dissuading him. Sarah kept Mrs. Plopler company in the kitchen. Mrs. Plopler, in the American style, was on his weekly night out with the boys.
The landlady probed into their past. She asked about the town they had come from, the state of the country, their business, their home. Sarah spoke a little, and when her words blundered towards her sons, she remembered her 4 men when they had been most fully hers. 4 straight backs, waiting for her at the dinner table, the shoulders of the boys gracefully molded, hard and vital under the clean shirts. She began to cry silently. Mrs. Plopler, in sympathy, began to cry as well, tentatively at first, then with great sloppy sobs, rocking herself from side to side and moaning intermittently over the terrible fate of the jury. When Abraham emerged in some alarm from the bedroom, Mrs. Plopler at once became terribly brave. She spoke touchingly to them of the new world, new friends, a new life. It seemed to Abraham at times that she was not so uncongenial as she appeared at other times. Perhaps, in the incomprehensible woman's way that draws courage from tears, she might be able to help his wife accept their fate. But no, a moment ago Mrs. Plopper had been weeping with Sarah, watering a wound that was far deeper than she could understand. Now, with tears scarcely dry, the last traces of moisture highlighting the ardent curiosity in her eyes as she leaned forward with casual eagerness. This Laiah, you've run into her at the shop. How does she strike you? What sort of type is she? Abraham fought back the twinge of impatience. Isaac had come into the kitchen and had pulled the chair close to where his mother sat. The boy put his arm around his mother. Abraham fingered his beard and frowned seriously at Mrs. Plopper. A type, he said, that likes corned beef, pastrami, lamb chops, chuck. He cast a sly sidelong glance at Sarah and Isaac. Isaac was smiling. He continued seriously, leg of mutton, veal, wieners, ribs. Yes, yes. Mrs. Plopler leaned forward again. But besides that, I mean, what is she like? I've seen her once or twice myself. She was pointed out to me, but myself I can't see what they made such a fuss about. You can't, said Abraham. The first time I saw her, she awakened desire in me. Mrs. Plopler's eyes widened, and she cast an indescribable glance at Sarah. Abraham's eyelid scarcely flickered. I said to myself, with only half the pelts in the fur coat that woman is wearing, my wife could have a fur coat that would keep her warm for 10, maybe 15 years. And her hair. He was inspired. You wouldn't believe it, but that hair is thick and auburn, just like the coat, brown and lustrous. Do you know that at first I could not tell where the hair left off and the coat began? I thought to myself, this must be either a very hairy woman, or else when the coat comes off, the hair comes off with it, and she is entirely bald. Isaac laughed out loud. Abraham sighed. I wonder how much such a coat would cost. You needn't worry, broke in Mrs. Plopler excitedly. She felt that she had unearthed a mine of information. That coat didn't cost her anything, nothing she isn't used to giving. She widened her eyes and distended her nostrils significantly at Abraham. Abraham returned her stare with an equally intense significance in his own. What? Cried Mrs. Plopler joyously. Does she behave like in the shop? I mean, when she comes in. My dear friend, what can I tell you? He looked again at his son and his wife. They say that a cow will stand in a green field and wave its tail and show its rear to every passing bull. Who knows? And that was enough. He felt a sudden annoyance at having indulged himself so far, even jokingly. What did he have to do with that woman, that he could take it upon himself to bandy her character around with such a one as Mrs. Plopper? What could she have to do with them, with her body that seemed to have difficulty keeping still inside of the luxurious fur coat, and her hoarse, low voice with its persistent animal call? She was what she was. The world was still the same. There were those who felt that, with God's mercy, if they stretched their bodies and their souls and created and built and grew, who knew what heights they, or their sons, or the sons of their sons might not reach? And there were those who preferred to go through life in other postures. It was not for him to laugh at her because he had chosen to live another life. Not especially while he could still understand the animal call. No, it was an unworthy thing. A man may choose the sunlight, but he has no right to pass casual judgment on the shadows. He would have to be more polite to Laiah the next time she came in to make an order. Isaac was still grinning broadly at his father's wit, but Abraham knew that, although Sarah smiled automatically, she only half listened, her mind elsewhere. There were some women. Mrs. Plopler was still talking, not willing to drop the subject so easily now that she had caught her tenant in such a sympathetic mood, that didn't know what decency meant. Yes, and they seemed to think that all the rest of womankind didn't follow their example and act like animals because they had never had a chance to. They couldn't understand that some people kept themselves clean and decent because they preferred it that way. Take herself, for instance. You might not think so now, Mrs. Plopler laughed, but she had been a very popular girl in her youth. Abraham, looking at Mrs. Plopler's face, lost track of her words. It was certainly warmer here in the kitchen than it was in their bedroom. It was no use, Abraham knew, to think about their own kitchen, with its smooth mud walls that he had so frequently whitewashed himself, and their oven. But that was an oven. In the winter, there was no fear that your boys would catch cold with that broad, warm oven to sleep on. Decent, Mrs. Plopper emphasized. She had always kept herself decent, like her daughters, who were even now having a good time. Mrs. Plopper looked accusingly at Isaac. Sarah leaned her head against Isaac's shoulder. He had lengthened out during the last few months, but he had gained very little weight since the typhus. What was this new world that they had come to? Avram was here, thank God, and Isaac, by some miracle. There was this woman who talked and talked, sometimes with little barbs in her words. Her own eyes grated together when she blinked them, and ached so. When she cried, it was no longer as though she cried with tears. The ocean had drained them away, and she cried now with only the pebbles on the beach. Men had wanted her, Mrs. Plopper testified. She had been considered not unattractive. Ah, but she had danced in her day. Mrs. Plopler scraped her feet on the linoleum, and the sound made a variation on her voice. Isaac listened. He wondered why his father didn't again break out of the humming coil of the landlady's eloquence. He had himself been Jacob, he would have picked up his father's joking vein, and together they would have so entangled Mrs. Plopper that she would still be struggling to find her way out. And then Moses would have sung a funny song that he had made up on the spur of the moment, all about what was happening. It seemed to Isaac that Moses had been capable of that. He himself and his mother would have sat and laughed and joined in sometimes. The whole would have been a riotous evening, and they would have all gone to bed afterwards, liking Mrs. Poplar, and well contented with themselves. Instead, they sat still and listened to her with irritation, or pretended to listen, for the look on his father's face was not that of a listener. Was he too thinking of what a night it would have been? Why hadn't he himself been able to think of something clever to say? What was it that he had said the other day that had his father roaring with laughter? His mother's head rested very lightly on his shoulder. Perhaps she was afraid to lean on him too heavily. He pressed her closer to him to get her to lean more heavily. She had grown so small. Discarded suitors, Mrs. Plopler revealed. One hadn't looked right to her. One didn't attend closely enough. One, out of pure caprice, Mrs. Plopler pursed her lips and smiled. Outside the window, the snow was falling, banking up comfortably against the window ledge. Soon, Abraham realized it would be Hanukkah, and a different celebration it would be from that of last year, he promised himself. Last year, when every word and ritual act had been accompanied by the little irony inside of himself that had made it a mockery. He knew now that he had been punished, but he too knew what mercy meant. Nevermore, he told himself fervently. A clever girl knows with a word and a look how to put a boy in his place, opined Mrs. Plopler. Amen. Abraham, stirred by his own thoughts, rumbled his conclusion aloud. Mrs. Plopler laughed. She allowed herself, caught by the mood of the moment, to lapse into silence. Her husband swam into her thoughts. What was it that he had found so attractive about his night out with the boys. God forbid that she should ever ask him again to give it up for 1 week. That one time had been enough to close up her mouth on the subject forever. This immigrant had not yet picked up the habit. Of course, where he came from, they had never heard of such a thing. Old country Jews. Mrs. Plopler smiled to herself in a superior way. Snow fell more heavily. The kitchen light grew more yellow in its effort to combat the encompassing night. A silence had fallen over them, so that Isaac could almost hear the falling of the snow as he watched it, dropping ever so slightly and evenly on blue mounds outside. Mrs. Plopler's eyes had taken on a slightly vacant look of reverie, and her nose was almost stilled in repose. Isaac felt himself on the edge of many worlds, intangible ones that seemed to exist in the silences and in the cracks and crannies of speech when a group of people sat in a room together. Was there a mind free in the imprisoned silence that could pry into their separate minds? Isaac looked anxiously about him. No, none could read his thoughts, nor he theirs. God? No. Isaac waited. The roof didn't fall. Only the snow fell, undisturbed. Right. And that is this section of the sacrifice. That was from the, well, a little bit of the second part of page 27 up to close to the end of page 31. All right. So thank you for joining me again tonight in this reading session. I apologize again for the imperfections. The typeface is really, really small, and I really have to be careful. And this is all really in one take, but otherwise, yeah, that was an interesting read. In any case, thank you again for joining me tonight. This is your host for this reading session, Pixel Broadside, otherwise known as a Pinoy in Victoria. If you liked what you've heard so far, please leave a like and subscribe. And I hope to see you again next week as we continue with the sacrifice. You take care, everyone. Bye bye, and have a great evening.